Building a better Bay Area. Moving forward, finding solutions. This is ABC7 News.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Liz Kreutz, and you're watching Getting Answers live on ABC7. Thanks for joining us. This is where we ask experts your questions every day at 3 to get answers for you in real time. Today, we're going to look at the future of overdose prevention programs in California as a bill to make safe injection sites a reality is headed to the governor's desk. The state director of the Drug Policy Alliance will join us in about 10 minutes. Also, UC Davis researchers have launched a first-of-its-kind study exploring the impact of wildfire smoke on reproductive health. The lead scientist for that study will be here to offer her insight. But first, voters in Kansas have rejected a statewide ban on abortions. Kansas is now the first state in the country to let voters weigh in on abortion since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Huge news nationally. And joining us live now to talk more about that vote and the potential impact on California and other states is New York Times reporter Maggie Astor. Maggie, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. How surprised were you by these results? Did you see this coming?
Certainly, I understood that it was possible that the constitutional amendment in Kansas would fail. I expected it to be a fairly close race in either direction. I was definitely surprised, and I think the experts I spoke with in Kansas were also surprised by the huge margin for the pro-abortion rights vote.
Right. I mean, the amendment didn't just fail, but it failed by a really wide margin, as you mentioned. So what do you think that says about where the country stands right now on abortion rights?
Well, it certainly indicates that there is a lot of anger among supporters of abortion rights about the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the consequences of that, the abortion bans and significant restrictions being passed in many states. It shows that that is an energizing factor for voters who support abortion rights. This is an incredibly important issue. It is something that will motivate them to turn out to vote in an election in which they otherwise likely would not have. That was a very significant thing about the Kansas vote. It was a primary. It was mostly Republican primaries on the ballot. There wasn't really a lot of reason for Democrats or independents to turn out for that election, except for this referendum. So it's really a strong indication of the salience of this specific issue to voters going forward.
For sure. What was the turnout like yesterday in Kansas?
So we don't have the final definitive numbers yet, but we can say it was very high. Estimates by my colleagues at the Times are that turnout was around 49%, which might not seem high, but primaries in Kansas and many other states, especially in non-presidential election years, routinely draw less than 30% turnout. So to get nearly 50% would be absolutely huge for a primary race like this.
Absolutely huge. In terms of who was coming out, was it really just that you saw a big wave of Democrats coming out to vote that maybe weren't expected to, or were you also seeing those in the Republican Party vote, you know, for abortion rights?
So it was a combination of both. We don't yet have the full demographic breakdown of who turned out. But certainly turnout was very high in the regions of Kansas that are more Democratic, the regions around Kansas City, for example. So there was absolutely high Democratic turnout. There's no doubt about that. But we also saw in the results across the state that the support for abortion rights was stronger than you might have expected really across the board. So, for example, if you look at a couple counties in western Kansas, which is a very rural, very conservative region, if you look at Hamilton County, for example, which voted 81% for President Trump in 2020, less than 56% chose the anti-abortion position on Tuesday. So the anti-abortion position was underperforming President Trump by a significant double-digit margin, even in that very conservative county. So it was a combination of really both turnout among Democrats and Republicans not being as universally in favor of these sorts of abortion restrictions.
Right. So ultimately, women are at the heart of this, at the heart of this decision. What is the impact for women?
Well, the immediate impact of the vote yesterday is that since Roe v. Wade was overturned, Kansas has been this sort of island of abortion access in a region where almost every state is outlawing or significantly restricting it. Talking about these southern states, these plain states, if you live in that part of the country, Kansas has been one of the only states in that region where abortion remains broadly accessible. And so the immediate impact of yesterday's vote is that that will remain the case. If the vote had gone the other way, the legislature could fairly quickly have begun to pass significant restrictions that would have eroded that access. So that's a very consequential and tangible impact for people in Kansas and the surrounding states.
Yeah, a huge impact for women in the Midwest. What do you think this says, big picture, about the midterms? Is there anything that we can foreshadow based on this decision? Maggie, you froze for just a second. Repeat that over again. We lost you for just a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would definitely caution against extrapolating too much from the vote yesterday. Not only because it's just one state, albeit obviously a very conservative state, but because this was very specific referendum on abortion. So there were no other issues where voters were weighing, do I care about this issue more than I care about this other issue? Is abortion more important than inflation? Mm-hmm. And party loyalties weren't really coming into play as much because the voters weren't voting for a candidate. So when the race was narrowed to this very specific issue, the verdict was very, very clear. And that certainly has implications for candidates who choose to campaign on abortion for November. Mm-hmm. It certainly has implication potentially for swing voters who may vote on this issue. But it is difficult to draw, direct extrapolations from a referendum on a single issue to the much more complicated landscape of a campaign in which people are voting on multiple issues and also voting on people and personalities.
Absolutely, but it's certainly a message and a message to the Supreme Court. Maggie Astor, thank you so much for joining us from the New York Times. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, we're going to look at overdose prevention programs here in California. What are they? Will they work? And what you should know. The state director of the Drug Policy Alliance will join us next on Getting Answers. Stick with us. All right, hi, Facebook. Thanks for joining us. Let me see if I have any of you weighing in yet. Gregory saying the people have spoken regarding this decision in Kansas, a huge decision. Really speaks to, I think, where voters nationally stand right now on this issue. John, good to see you. Toe, good to see you. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. Again, we're going to talk about safe consumption sites coming up, our overdose prevention programs. There's a bill that's on the governor's desk right now that will allow for safe injection sites in Bay Area cities in Oakland and San Francisco, as well as Los Angeles. So we are going to talk about what that is and what that means in the fight to end the drug crisis. So stick with us and we'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back. A bill to provide safe injection sites in Bay Area cities is headed to Governor Newsom's desk. On Monday, the state Senate gave final approval to SB 57, and this bill clears the way for San Francisco, Oakland, as well as Los Angeles to authorize places for people to use illegal drugs under supervision. If Governor Newsom signs it into law, that would take effect January 1st. So joining us live now to talk about that and the potential impact is Jeannette Zanipatin, the director of California's Drug Policy Alliance. Jeannette, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So for people who maybe aren't following this as closely, what are safe injection sites and how do they work?
So safe injection sites are models that have been used for over the past 20 years in places like Europe to allow folks that are substance users a safe, clean, hygienic space to be able to inject drugs. But while in addition to providing these safe spaces, these centers become sources of information and connection for individuals who potentially are homeless or unhoused, may use drugs in isolation. And so the whole purpose is, one, to prevent overdoses, but two, to ensure that these connections are made with individuals who, when they're ready to seek services such as substance treatment services or other services, including access to housing and food, they have a center where they can have a trusted source of information.
There's clearly a major drug crisis in California. So why, in your opinion, do you think programs like this are a good solution for that?
Well, the past 20 years have demonstrated that these centers are backed by science and evidence and have proven effective to help alleviate the overdose crisis in different parts of Europe, as well as in Canada. But in addition to that, I mean, I think that, what we have been doing in our country in terms of criminalizing folks that use drugs and stigmatizing its use without really looking at it from a public health approach and without offering assistance for things like healthcare, mental health, and substance treatment, we've just been failing. And so we really need to use every tool in the toolbox to try to address this overdose crisis. In California, our overdose crisis is in particularly hitting communities of color in a really significant way. And we really need to make these centers accessible to all Californians.
So now that SB 57 has passed, it's on the governor's desk, what happens next? Do you expect the governor to sign it?
Well, we remain hopeful that the governor will sign the bill. Depending on when the bill gets sent to the governor, he may have 12 days to sign it, or he may have 30. And so we're sort of in that window right now. We are doing all our advocacy efforts to ensure that the governor signs this bill. When he was running for governor back in 2018, he said that he would sign this measure. And so we're hopeful that he keeps true to his word and that he takes California one step closer to ensuring that we are, again, using every tool in our toolbox to address the overdose crisis.
You mentioned that other cities like New York City, cities in Europe and Canada have already implemented overdose prevention programs like this. So what can we learn from those cities? Have they been proven to lower drug overdoses, or what else have we learned from them?
Yeah, so New York has been operating 2 overdose prevention centers, one in Harlem and one in Washington Heights since November. They have been able to reverse over 300 overdoses within that time frame. In 2021, New York City lost over 2,000 folks to the overdose crisis. So that's a significant number of lives saved. We also know that folks that go to overdose prevention centers tend to frequent them often, which means that they are making those connections, possibly going in for further treatment and services, and are getting linked to resources to really help with the overdose crisis. The one thing we also know is that no one has ever died in an overdose prevention center worldwide, and so that is significant.
So what do you say to people who hear about these sites and they just feel that it's only going to further enable drug use?
Yeah, I mean, we hear from both sides, and we've heard from parents who have lost children to the overdose crisis, and they have stated, had my child or my adult son or daughter had access to one of these overdose prevention centers, they may be here today. I think all the science, evidence, and research backs their efficacy, and we need to, again, make these available in communities where we're seeing the overdose crisis hit Californians the hardest.
So what are they going to look like? Like here in San Francisco, what is this going to look like in practice, and what resources are going to be offered there?
Right. Well, every jurisdiction is going to adopt an overdose prevention center to fit the needs of their community. So they may look, physically different. They may be housed in a building. There may be other options in terms of other types of units that are created. But in every sense of the word, these are they look like health clinics. You walk into a center, you sign up, and you will have access to clean syringes, clean supplies. You will be able to get advice from medical personnel. Should you have any questions, and should you need referrals, you will get referred to whatever services you may need. So in every sense of the word, it's like walking into a clinic where someone who's a substance user just doesn't feel stigmatized or criminalized for their drug use.
Right. Does it help, or is there any evidence to show at all that it can also help clean up the streets? Because right now, in the Tenderloin here in San Francisco, it's just blocks and blocks of folks sometimes sitting out on the street.
Yes, it does. If you look at On Point in New York City, they are actually located, one of their centers is located across a preschool. So you can imagine what the streets looked like in the mornings when parents were taking their kids to school. We've heard anecdotally that the street is definitely a lot cleaner. There are not, we don't have folks loitering out in front of the center in New York. Lynch syringe litter is definitely down. And folks are utilizing the services to the extent possible, which, is providing, word of mouth. More and more folks are taking advantage of these centers, and public safety is enhanced because of this.
All right, so what's next? Let's say it does get signed by the governor. Do you think that means we're going to be seeing beyond just LA, San Francisco, Oakland? We'll see these sites around California?
Right now, the bill only allows for a pilot to be done for the next 5 years in these 3 jurisdictions. Okay. The bill was also amended to ensure that we also evaluate the pilots. So depending on how the pilot goes and the evaluation, we may see the expansion, but we still need to wait for the 5-year period to sunset.
All right, we'll see. Well, Jeannette Zanipatin from the Drug Policy Alliance, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Up next, a UC Davis researcher is going to join us to discuss the important work that she's studying. She's studying the link between wildfire smoke and reproductive health. Stay with us. Getting Answers continues after this quick break. All right, let me see Facebook before I put you all on a break. Let's see if we have any of you guys weighing in. Randy's wondering how much these sites are going to cost. Sorry, I didn't get to that question, but my colleague Luz Pena is doing a story today airing in our evening shows, so watch for that, and she'll have more questions answered locally as well here in San Francisco, what it's going to look like. Randy's saying I think it should be put to a public vote for open drug use sites if our tax dollars would be used to fund them. Alex is concerned about this. What is this going to do or improve? It will be interesting. Alex believes it's a waste of taxpayer money. I think, as Jeannette said, I think it's just different things need to be tried to try and solve this crisis, and this is one of them, and this is a pilot program. So if it passes, it will be a pilot program for 5 years, and we'll be able to see the impacts before it potentially continues or expands. So we'll see. Anyway, stick with us. I'm going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with our final guest in just a minute. Welcome back. Here in California, we are seeing wildfires grow to a level never experienced before. Fires are destroying millions of acres every year and creating air quality that's so bad, sometimes people are forced to stay indoors for weeks. But just how bad is that air for pregnant women? Researchers from UC Davis are shedding light on that with a study looking at how wildfire smoke is affecting pregnant women and their babies and moms-to-be. So joining us live now to talk about this study is the lead scientist for it, Rebecca Schmidt, an assistant professor at UC Davis. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
I'm fascinated to hear more about this. So first, tell us more about your research. Why is it so important that we study the impacts of wildfires on moms and moms-to-be?
Sure. So when we began this research several years ago, there was really very little known about what kind of impacts that wildfire exposure in particular could have on pregnant women and their developing babies. And so we started these studies with a thought that we knew a lot about what ambient air pollution or traffic-related air pollution that does seem to be associated with various pregnancy and birth outcomes for children. And so we thought it was important to see what these more short-term wildfire exposures how those could be impacting pregnant women and their developing babies as well. So we started these studies with that in mind, and now there have been several studies that have been published now showing that there is an association between wildfire exposure and lower birth weight in babies, and also sometimes a shorter gestational age, especially if there's exposure in the second trimester. And so now we're trying to really understand what other impacts and how this is, what are the major drivers of those associations. So like what types of exposure in the wildfire smoke, or whether it's the wildfire events themselves that are causing or impacting some of these associations.
Right. So how many women have you enrolled so far for this, and what fires have they been impacted by?
Yeah, so we started originally with the 2017 Napa and Sonoma fires, and those were at the time some of the largest fires that had hit California. And then the next year there was the 2018 Camp Fire, which then took on the role as the largest wildfire in California and wiped out whole cities of Paradise, and then became the deadliest and largest fire. And then there was 2019 Kincaid Fire, which was not quite as impactful and not quite as large. And then the 2020 wildfire season, there was a lightning complex fire. So every year we've ended up continuing our study and enrolling moms from each of these fires, including 2021 as well. And we are putting together all of that data. So we have a little over 500 moms that are enrolled and who had babies during these times. And now we're getting to where we're looking at some of that data.
Yeah, what have you learned so far from these women?
Yeah, so we're kind of early in our research, but we have seen certain things. So not only in our studies, but other studies, we are seeing we also collect a lot of biospecimens from these moms and some from their babies, but mostly from the moms. And we have looked at things like metals in the mom's hair, and we can kind of use that as a timeline, and we can see levels before, during, and after the wildfires if their hair is long enough. And we do see some peaks in some of these metals during the wildfire period. Now, whether that's associated with any later outcomes, we haven't gotten that far yet, and we also need to replicate which metals, and because it has been so far, it could be different for each of these fires, and we've only looked at the 2017 fires so far, but right now we're looking at 2018 fires. And then we've also looked at some blood markers, and we've seen that there are some inflammatory, like cytokines and other things in mom's blood that are increased when they have these wildfire exposures.
Should women be concerned, and what should women do, especially women who are pregnant, do during wildfire season? Yeah,
so the thing we really don't know yet, how this relates to their child in particular, and it's different for every woman and depending on timing and lots of things and their overall exposure. But moms can minimize their exposure, and that seems to be a good idea just in general for her health, but also in terms of her baby's health. So she can do that by staying indoors, running an air conditioner if possible, or with an air filter in it. And if you don't have access to that, you can make a box fan air filter. So we're going to be going out in the community and teaching people how to create these box fans filters that work pretty well. but any way to, or buy air purifiers, anything to keep clean air indoor and then stay indoors as much as possible. And then if you do need to go outside, to wear an N95 mask to protect yourself from breathing in those particles.
Right. And you are working on another study, I believe, about women of childbearing age, ages 18 to 40. How can women be part of that study?
Yeah, so there's another study called What Now, where, or basically anyone, it's open to anybody, where, like, not pregnant people,
okay.
Where we are collecting information and samples to kind of figure out just overall what are the impacts of wildfire events on people. So, right. Because there really is little known.
And why is that so important for us to study that, specifically when it comes to women and reproductive health, but also just people in general?
Yeah, one of the things that we really don't know is like long-term impacts. So there's very little to show, you know, because these are more recent events, at least at the size they have been and the concentrations of pollutants we've had in the more recent fires. So we just really don't know how those might relate to respiratory and cardiovascular and other outcomes down the road. And for pregnant women, you know, the effects on their children developing and even just younger children too. So there's a lot we've learned just from non-human primate studies, like in terms of macaques and looking at them. They have the same exposures because a lot of them are housed outdoors in these wildfire events. And so we've seen fertility impacts, again, some birth outcome impacts and some behavioral impacts on the developing child, as well as respiratory impacts. And so these are all things that kind of are a signal to us that this is something to learn more about.
Absolutely. A lot to learn, and we're thankful that you're doing this research. We hope to check in with you when we get some more answers. So, Professor Schmidt, thank you so much from UC Davis. Thanks for joining us. All right, Getting Answers continues in just a moment, but first a reminder, you can get our live newscast, breaking news, weather, and more with our ABC7 Bay Area streaming TV app. It's available on Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, and Roku. Just search ABC7 Bay Area and download it.